The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone courtyard of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla stepped out of the private residence. Her pearl necklace caught the early light, and her tailored navy suit spoke of authority and tradition. She had been queen consort for nearly 2 years now. With King Charles away on a diplomatic tour to Australia, she was tasked with overseeing the daily operations of the royal household. It was a responsibility she took seriously. Perhaps too seriously, according to some of the long-time palace staff. The castle grounds were unusually quiet that Tuesday morning in October. Most of the tourists wouldn't arrive for another hour, and the changing of the guard ceremony was still being prepared. Camilla had decided to take her morning walk earlier than usual, wanting to clear her head before a full day of meetings and public appearances. She moved through the corridors with practiced grace, nodding to staff members who bowed as she passed. As she approached the East Terrace garden, she noticed something that made her pause. One of the Royal Guard officers, a tall man in his late 30s, with graying temples and a weathered face, was standing at his post, but seemed distracted. He was looking at his phone, something strictly forbidden while on duty. The bright screen illuminated his face in the shadowy alcove where he stood. Camilla felt a surge of irritation rise within her chest. The Royal Guard represented centuries of British tradition and discipline. They were supposed to be the very embodiment of duty and professionalism. Seeing one of them so casually breaking protocol felt like a personal affront, especially now when she was trying to prove herself capable of managing things in Charles's absence. She changed her direction and walked purposefully toward the guard. Her footsteps echoed on the ancient stone floor, but the man didn't look up. He was too absorbed in whatever was on his phone screen. As she got closer, Camilla could see the identification badge on his uniform read Officer James Whitmore. 15 years of service? 15 years? And he was behaving like a rookie on his first day? She thought. When she was just a few feet away, she cleared her throat loudly. The sound reverberated in the quiet morning air. Officer Whitmore's head snapped up immediately, his eyes widening in recognition and what appeared to be shock. He quickly shoved the phone into his pocket and stood at rigid attention, his face flushing red beneath his formal bearskin cap. "Officer Whitmore?" Camilla said, her voice sharp and cold. She stood before him with her arms crossed, her posture radiating disapproval. "I assume you're aware that using personal mobile devices while on duty is strictly prohibited." The guard's jaw tightened. He stared straight ahead, not meeting her eyes. Following the protocol that guards were not supposed to make direct eye contact with royalty unless addressed personally. "Yes, Your Majesty," he replied, his voice strained and formal. Camilla took a step closer, invading the formal space that usually existed between royalty and their guards. "Then perhaps you can explain to me why you were staring at your phone like a teenager at a bus stop. This is Windsor Castle, not a shopping mall. You represent the Crown, Officer Whitmore. Your behavior reflects on all of us." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. A few other staff members who were passing through the corridor slowed their pace, sensing tension but not daring to stop or stare. The air felt thick and heavy between the Queen and the guard. Finally, Whitmore spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I apologize, Your Majesty. It won't happen again." But Camilla wasn't satisfied with the apology. Something about his tone, the way he delivered those words with such mechanical precision, irritated her further. She wanted him to understand the gravity of his mistake, to show real remorse rather than just following protocol. "I should hope not," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "When King Charles returns, I'll be discussing this incident with him. I won't tolerate such lax behavior from the Royal Guard. Do you understand me?" Whitmore's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Yes, Your Majesty." Camilla felt her frustration growing. She had expected more deference, more genuine contrition. Instead, she felt like she was talking to a wall. In that moment, perhaps driven by stress or a desire to assert her authority more firmly, she said something she would later regret. "I'm still your monarch, Officer Whitmore. Whether Charles is here or not, you answer to me. I expect absolute obedience and respect from every member of this household. Is that clear?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Camilla immediately sensed she had overstepped, but pride prevented her from backing down. She waited for his acknowledgement, for him to bow his head and accept her authority without question. What happened next would change everything. "Officer," Whitmore's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. His shoulders, which had been rigidly at attention, relaxed just slightly. He turned his head and, for the first time in their exchange, looked directly at her. His eyes were not hostile, but they weren't subservient either. They were clear, direct, and surprisingly calm. "With respect, Your Majesty," he began, his voice steady and measured, "you are the Queen Consort. You are not the monarch. That title belongs to His Majesty King Charles III. I serve the crown and the monarch, and I take my duties very seriously, as my 15 years of unblemished service will attest." Camilla felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her face flushed hot with embarrassment and anger. Nobody spoke to her like that. Nobody corrected her, especially not a guard who was supposed to follow orders without question. "How dare you?" she whispered. But her voice lacked its earlier authority. Whitmore continued undeterred. "I was looking at my phone because I received an emergency message from the hospital. My daughter was admitted 2 hours ago with a severe asthma attack. I've been waiting for an update from my wife, and when I saw the message, I couldn't help but check it. I apologize for the breach of protocol, and I'm prepared to face whatever disciplinary action you deem appropriate. But I won't apologize for being human. And I won't stand here and be lectured about duty by someone who seems to have forgotten that respect is earned, not demanded." The silence that followed was deafening. Camilla stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, unable to formulate a response. She had walked into this confrontation expecting a simple dressing down of an insubordinate employee. Instead, she found herself facing a man who had legitimate reasons for his actions and the courage to stand up for himself. Other staff members who had been discreetly watching from a distance quickly scattered, pretending they hadn't witnessed the exchange. But Camilla knew the damage was done. By morning's end, this story would be whispered about in every corner of the castle. By afternoon, it would likely reach the ears of senior palace officials. By evening, it might even make its way to King Charles himself. She wanted to say something, to regain control of the situation, but every response that came to mind seemed inadequate or would make things worse. She was trapped between acknowledging her mistake and maintaining her dignity. Officer Whitmore saved her from having to decide. He gave a formal bow, his movements precise and correct. "If you'll excuse me, Your Majesty, I should properly report my situation to my commanding officer and request permission to be relieved from my post so I can attend to my family emergency. I trust you'll understand." Without waiting for her response, he turned smartly on his heel and walked away, his back straight and his pace measured. He didn't run, didn't show any disrespect in his departure, but he also didn't wait for her permission to leave. Camilla stood alone in the corridor, the morning sun now streaming through the tall windows, illuminating the spot where the confrontation had taken place. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and deeply unsettled. In trying to assert her authority, she had instead revealed its limitations. In demanding respect, she had shown that her understanding of her own role was perhaps not as clear as she had thought, as she finally turned to continue her walk. Her steps were slower and less confident than they had been. The rest of the day stretched ahead of her, filled with meetings and appearances, but all she could think about was those few, devastating words that had cut through her pretensions like a knife through butter. "You are not the monarch." The truth of those words would haunt her for days to come, and the consequences of this brief exchange would ripple through the palace in ways she couldn't yet imagine. This was not just about a guard with a phone anymore. This was about power, respect, duty, and the delicate balance that held the entire institution of the monarchy together. And somewhere in that balance, Camilla had just lost her footing. By noon, the entire palace staff knew about the confrontation. News traveled fast within the ancient walls of Windsor Castle. It's carried by hushed whispers in service corridors and knowing glances exchanged during lunch breaks. The story had grown slightly with each retelling, as stories often do, but the essential facts remained unchanged. Queen Camilla had confronted a royal guard officer, claimed to be his monarch, and been corrected firmly and publicly. Lady Margaret Thornberry, the senior lady-in-waiting who had served the royal family for over 30 years, was the first to address the situation directly with Camilla. She found the queen consort in her private sitting room, staring out the window at the gardens below. A cup of untouched tea sat cooling on the side table, and the papers Camilla was supposed to be reviewing lay scattered and unread. "Your Majesty," Lady Margaret began gently, closing the door behind her to ensure privacy. "I thought you might want to discuss this morning's incident before the evening briefing." Camilla didn't turn from the window. "I suppose everyone knows by now. The staff is talking, yes. But that's to be expected. These things happen in any workplace." Lady Margaret moved closer, her tone diplomatic but honest. "However, I think we need to consider how to manage this situation before it escalates further." Camilla finally turned, and Lady Margaret was struck by how tired she looked. The confident woman who had entered the courtyard that morning seemed diminished somehow, burdened by more than just embarrassment. "I made a fool of myself, Margaret. I let my temper get the better of me, and I said something that wasn't technically accurate." Camilla sat down heavily in one of the antique chairs. "He was right to correct me. I'm not the monarch. I'm the queen consort. There's a difference, and I should have remembered that." Lady Margaret settled into the chair opposite her. "You're being too hard on yourself. Yes, the terminology was imprecise, but your authority in the king's absence is real. You have every right to maintain standards and discipline among the staff." "But that's just it," Camilla said, her voice breaking slightly. "I wasn't maintaining standards. I was being petty and vindictive because I saw someone breaking a rule and I wanted to feel powerful. I didn't even ask why he was on his phone. I just assumed the worst and went on the attack." The two women sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the afternoon tours were beginning. They could hear the distant sounds of tourists exclaiming over the state apartments. "His daughter's in the hospital," Camilla continued quietly. "A severe asthma attack. He was waiting for news about whether she was all right, and I stood there and lectured him about duty and respect while he was worried sick about his child." Lady Margaret leaned forward. "Did you know that when you approached him?" "Of course not. But I didn't bother to ask, did I? I just assumed he was being lazy or disrespectful." Camilla pressed her fingers to her temples. "And now he's probably going to be disciplined because of me, and his daughter is in the hospital. And the entire staff thinks I'm a tyrant who doesn't understand her own position." "Actually," Lady Margaret said carefully, "Officer Whitmore has not been disciplined. His commanding officer reviewed the situation and granted him emergency leave to be with his family. The breach of protocol is being overlooked given the circumstances." Camilla looked up, surprised. "They're not disciplining him?" "No, and frankly, I think that's the right decision. His service record is impeccable. 15 years without a single black mark. He was dealing with a family emergency in the most discreet way possible, and when confronted, he explained himself honestly and respectfully." "Respectfully?" Camilla let out a bitter laugh. "He told me I wasn't the monarch, in front of other staff members. How is that respectful?" Lady Margaret chose her words carefully. "He stated a fact, Your Majesty. He did it without raising his voice, without showing disrespect in his bearing or tone. He simply corrected a misstatement. If anything, I think he showed remarkable restraint given the circumstances. Another person might have responded with anger or resentment. He simply stood his ground with dignity." Camilla absorbed this, turning the words over in her mind. She'd expected Lady Margaret to validate her hurt feelings, to agree that Whitmore had been insubordinate and deserved punishment. Instead, she was being offered a different perspective, one that made her even more uncomfortable because it suggested she was in the wrong. "What should I do?" she asked finally, sounding more vulnerable than she had in years. "I think," Lady Margaret said slowly, "you should consider speaking with Officer Whitmore. Not to reprimand him or defend yourself, but to apologize. To acknowledge that you were hasty in your judgment and that you understand he was dealing with a family crisis." Camilla's first instinct was to refuse. Queens didn't apologize to guards. It would undermine her authority even further. But even as these thoughts formed, she recognized them as pride talking. The same pride that had gotten her into this mess in the first place. Won't that make me look weak? Admitting I was wrong to someone so far below me in rank? Your Majesty, Lady Margaret said with unusual firmness. With all due respect, that kind of thinking is exactly what created this problem. Officer Whitmore isn't below you because of his rank. He's a human being doing a difficult job with dedication and honor. Yes, there's a hierarchy, and yes, you have authority. But that authority comes with responsibility, including the responsibility to admit mistakes and treat people with basic human compassion. The words stung, but Camilla knew they were true. She had been so focused on establishing her position, on proving herself capable in Charles's absence, that she had forgotten the most basic principles of leadership. She had treated Whitmore not as a person, but as an obstacle to her authority. That evening, Camilla made several phone calls. First to King Charles in Australia, explaining the situation before he heard a distorted version from someone else. To her relief, he was understanding rather than angry, though he did gently point out that she needed to be more careful about protocol and terminology. "Darling," he said, his voice crackling slightly over the international connection. "You're doing a wonderful job in my absence, but you don't need to overcompensate. The staff respects you. They know your role and your value. You don't need to constantly assert your authority. In fact, the most powerful leaders are often the ones who lead with grace and humility rather than force." Camilla contacted Officer Whitmore's commanding officer and requested a private meeting with the guard when he returned from his emergency leave. The commanding officer, a stern man named Colonel Davies, was surprised by the request, but agreed to arrange it.
"Ow.
"Is his daughter?" Camilla asked. "She's stable now, Your Majesty. They got her breathing under control, and she'd be kept in the hospital for observation for a few days. But the doctors are optimistic." "Good. That's good." Camilla paused. "Please extend my best wishes to Officer Whitmore and his family, and tell him that when he's ready to return to duty, I would appreciate a few minutes of his time, privately." The news of the requested meeting spread through the palace even faster than the story of the confrontation had. Staff members speculated endlessly about what it meant. Some thought Camilla was going to formally reprimand Whitmore in private. Others believed she was going to try to intimidate him into retracting his statement. A few optimistic souls hoped she might actually apologize. 3 days later, Officer Whitmore returned to duty. His daughter was recovering well at home, and though he was exhausted from sleepless nights at the hospital, he reported for work with his usual punctuality and professionalism. He had heard about the Queen Consort's request for a meeting, and while he was apprehensive, he was also curious. He had expected consequences for speaking to her so directly. But so far, none had materialized. The meeting was scheduled for late afternoon in one of the smaller private rooms near the Queen Consort's quarters. As Whitmore walked through the palace corridors to the appointed location, he was acutely aware of the eyes following him. Everyone wanted to know what would happen behind those closed doors. When he entered the room, he found Camilla waiting alone. No lady-in-waiting, no secretary, no witnesses. Just her, standing by the window with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Officer Whitmore," she said, her voice neutral. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Please, sit down." He remained standing. "With respect, Your Majesty, I prefer to stand." Camilla nodded, understanding that he wanted to maintain the formal distance of their respective positions. She took a deep breath, and what she said next surprised them both. "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air between them. Whitmore's carefully maintained neutral expression cracked slightly. Showing genuine shock, Camilla continued, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "I was wrong to confront you the way I did. I should have asked if there was a reason for your behavior before jumping to conclusions and making accusations. You were dealing with a family emergency, and instead of showing compassion, I showed arrogance and pettiness." Whitmore opened his mouth to speak, but Camilla held up a hand. "Please let me finish. You were also right about the terminology. I'm not the monarch. I'm the Queen Consort, and while I have certain responsibilities and authority, I overstepped by claiming a title that isn't mine. You had every right to correct me, and I respect you for having the courage to do so respectfully and honestly." The silence that followed was different from the tense, angry silence of their first confrontation. This was contemplative, almost peaceful. "How is your daughter?" Camilla asked, her voice gentler now. "She's home now, Your Majesty. Recovering well? Thank you for asking. I'm glad to hear it." Camilla moved away from the window, closer to where Whitmore stood. "I have children too. Stepchildren, but I love them dearly. If one of them were in the hospital, I would have been out of my mind with worry. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been for you to stand at your post, trying to maintain protocol while terrified for your daughter's life." For the first time since entering the room, Whitmore's military bearing softened slightly. "It was the hardest morning of my career," he admitted quietly. "I made it harder," Camilla said, "and for that, I am truly sorry. I hope you can forgive me." Officer Whitmore stood at attention once more, but this time there was warmth in his eyes rather than defensive coldness. "There's nothing to forgive, Your Majesty. You were doing your duty as you saw it, and I respect that. I hope I didn't speak out of turn." "You spoke the truth," Camilla said firmly. "That's never out of turn. Not really." They stood together for a moment, two people from vastly different worlds who had found common ground in honesty and humility. The power dynamic that had seemed so important days ago faded into insignificance compared to the simple human connection they had established. As Officer Whitmore prepared to leave, Camilla stopped him with one final question. "James," she said, using his first name for the first time, "what made you decide to speak up that morning? You could have just accepted the reprimand and said nothing." Whitmore considered the question carefully before answering. "Your Majesty, I've served the crown for 15 years. I've stood guard in rain and snow, faced down threats, and maintained my post through exhaustion and illness. I love this job and what it represents. But that morning, watching my phone for news about my daughter, I realized something important. We serve the institution of the monarchy, yes, but we're also human beings with families and feelings and limits. If I had stayed silent and just accepted your criticism, I would have been saying that none of that matters, that I'm just a uniform without a person inside it. I couldn't do that. Not that morning, not when my daughter was fighting for breath in a hospital bed." His words struck Camilla deeply. She nodded slowly, understanding for perhaps the first time the weight that ordinary people carried while serving institutions much larger than themselves. "Thank you for your honesty," she said. "And thank you for your service. Not just to the crown, but for today as well. You've taught me something valuable about respect and dignity, and I won't forget it." As Whitmore left the room, Camilla sat down heavily in the chair she had earlier offered him. The encounter had been more emotionally exhausting than she had anticipated, but she felt lighter somehow, cleaner, as if a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. Lady Margaret found her there an hour later, still sitting quietly in thought. "How did it go?" the lady-in-waiting asked. Camilla smiled, and it was genuine. "Better than I deserved. He accepted my apology with grace. We talked like human beings instead of titles and ranks." "Good," Lady Margaret said warmly. "That's very good indeed." But both women knew that while the personal matter was resolved, the public perception was another issue entirely. The story of the confrontation had already spread beyond the palace walls, and there would be consequences to manage in the days ahead. The story broke in the tabloids, exactly 1 week after the initial confrontation. The headline in the Daily Mirror screamed in bold letters, "Queen Camilla put in her place by Royal Guard." The Sun went with "Not Your Monarch. Guard schools Camilla on royal protocol." Even the more respectable broadsheets couldn't resist the story, with the Times running a thoughtful piece titled "The Delicate Balance of Power Within Palace Walls." Camilla sat in her private study. A stack of newspapers spread across the mahogany desk before her. Each one told a slightly different version of the story, some sympathetic to her position, others portraying her as an overreaching consort who didn't understand her role. The comment sections online were even worse, filled with people she had never met passing judgment on her character, her marriage, and her right to even be in the palace. "They weren't there," she said aloud to the empty room. "None of them know what actually happened." But even as she said it, she recognized the futility of the complaint. The truth rarely mattered once a story caught fire in the media. What mattered was the narrative. And right now, the narrative was that Queen Camilla had been publicly embarrassed by a common guard, who knew protocol better than she did. Her press secretary, a sharp woman named Victoria Chen, had been fielding calls from media outlets around the world for the past 2 days. Every interview request was politely declined. Every demand for comment met with a standard statement about respecting the privacy of palace staff and their families. But the silence from the palace was being interpreted as confirmation that the stories were true. King Charles called again from his tour, this time more concerned than understanding. "Darling, we need to address this. The longer we stay silent, the worse it becomes." Victoria is recommending a brief statement, something to acknowledge the incident but reframe it in a more positive light.
Oh.
Camilla closed her eyes, pressing her fingers against her temples where a headache had been building for hours. What kind of statement? An apology? A denial? What am I supposed to say, Charles? That I was wrong? That I wasn't wrong? Either way, we lose. "We don't have to frame it as right or wrong," Charles said carefully. "We frame it as a human moment. A misunderstanding between two people under stress that was resolved privately and amicably. We emphasize Officer Whitmore's dedication and his daughter's health. We make it about compassion rather than conflict." It was sound advice, the kind of careful public relations management that the royal family had perfected over decades. But something in Camilla rebelled against it. She was tired of careful statements and managed narratives. She was tired of having every word weighed and measured and stripped of genuine emotion. "What if I just told the truth?" she asked suddenly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean? What if I gave an interview and told people exactly what happened? Not a managed statement, not a carefully worded press release. Just me explaining what I did wrong and what I learned from it. Would that be so terrible?" Charles was silent for so long that Camilla thought they might have been disconnected. When he finally spoke, his voice was cautious. "That's a very risky approach. You would be opening yourself up to criticism and mockery. The media would tear apart every word you said." "They're already doing that," Camilla pointed out. "At least this way, I'd be controlling my own narrative. I'd be showing people that I'm capable of admitting mistakes and learning from them. Isn't that better than hiding behind official statements?" The conversation continued for another hour, with Charles expressing reservations and Camilla growing more convinced that radical honesty might be the only way forward. By the time they ended the call, Charles had reluctantly agreed to support whatever decision she made. Though he made her promise to discuss it with Victoria and the senior palace advisors before committing to anything, the meeting with the advisors was contentious. Gathered in the formal conference room were Victoria Chen, Lady Margaret Thornbury, the King's private secretary, Sir Edmund Blackwood, and the palace's legal counsel, Richard Morrison. All of them had decades of experience managing royal crises, and all of them thought Camilla's proposed interview was a terrible idea, Your Majesty. "With all due respect, this is exactly what the tabloids want," Sir Edmund said, his jowls shaking with emphasis. "They want you to publicly humiliate yourself. They want footage they can clip and replay endlessly, headlines they can generate from every sentence you utter. You would be feeding the beast." Victoria nodded in agreement. "The usual approach works because it starves stories of oxygen. We give minimal comment, we wait for the news cycle to move on, and within 2 weeks, this is forgotten. But if you do an interview, you give the story new life. It becomes not just about a confrontation, but about your judgment in discussing it publicly." Only Lady Margaret seemed torn. "I understand the risks," she said carefully, "but I also understand Her Majesty's instinct here. The public is changing. They don't want managed royal families anymore. They want authenticity even if it's messy. Especially if it's messy." "Messy is dangerous," Richard Morrison interjected. "Messy creates legal complications and diplomatic headaches. What if Her Majesty says something in the interview that's used against the palace in an employment dispute? What if her words are twisted to suggest systemic problems with how staff are treated?" The arguments went back and forth for nearly 2 hours. Charts were presented showing public opinion polling. Previous royal PR disasters were analyzed as cautionary tales, Legal ramifications were outlined in exhaustive detail. Every possible consequence was examined and debated. Through it all, Camilla sat quietly, listening but not engaging. She understood their concerns. These were intelligent, experienced people who had guided the royal family through countless crises. They weren't wrong to be cautious, but something fundamental had shifted inside her during that confrontation with Officer Whitmore and the subsequent private apology. She had discovered that honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, was more powerful than carefully managed appearances. Finally, she held up her hand, silencing the debate. "I appreciate all of your counsel. I truly do. You've served this family with dedication and wisdom. And I know your concerns come from a place of genuine care for the institution. But I've made my decision. I'm going to do the interview." The room erupted in protests, but Camilla continued speaking over them. "I will be careful. I will be thoughtful. But I will also be honest. The public deserves to know that I'm capable of making mistakes and learning from them. They deserve to see that being royal doesn't mean being perfect or being above accountability." Sir Edmund made one final attempt. "Your Majesty, King Charles, has given me his support to make my own decision on this matter," Camilla finished firmly. "This is my mistake to address, and I will address it in the way I think is right." The advisors left the meeting looking defeated and worried. Only Lady Margaret lingered behind. "That took courage," she said quietly. "Or stupidity," Camilla replied with a weak smile. "I suppose we'll find out which." The interview was scheduled with the BBC for later that week. The journalist chosen was Sophie Crawford, known for her tough but fair questioning style. The palace negotiated that the interview would be live, rather than pre-recorded, which surprised many observers. Live interviews left no room for editing or second thoughts, but they also appeared more authentic and unmanipulated. As the day of the interview approached, Camilla found herself both terrified and oddly calm. She refused to over-prepare, declined the offer of a professional media coach, and insisted on minimal makeup and styling. She wanted to appear as herself, not as a carefully constructed royal image. The night before the interview, she couldn't sleep. She kept playing different scenarios in her mind, imagining hostile questions and devastating headlines. But she also thought about Officer Whitmore and the quiet dignity he had shown. If he could stand up for truth in the face of royal displeasure, surely she could stand up for truth in the face of media scrutiny. The morning of the interview, she chose to wear a simple blue dress, her grandmother's modest pearls and minimal jewelry. When Victoria saw her, she looked worried. "You look very casual, Your Majesty. Are you sure you don't want something more formal? More authoritative?" "I'm not trying to look authoritative," Camilla said. "I'm trying to look honest." The interview took place in one of Windsor Castle's smaller receiving rooms. It's chosen for its intimate feel rather than its grandeur. Sophie Crawford arrived early, professional, and composed. She shook Camilla's hand firmly and thanked her for the opportunity. "I want you to know," Sophie said, as they were being prepared for filming, "I'm going to ask difficult questions. That's my job. But I promise to be fair." "I wouldn't want it any other way," Camilla replied. When the cameras began rolling and Sophie Crawford asked her first question about the confrontation with Officer Whitmore, Camilla took a deep breath and began to speak. She told the whole story, not the sanitized version her advisors had hoped for, but the real one. She admitted her anger, her pride, her hasty judgment. She explained Officer Whitmore's situation and his response. She acknowledged her mistake in claiming to be the monarch and her realization that authority without compassion was hollow. "I learned something important that day," Camilla said, looking directly into the camera. "I learned that leadership isn't about demanding respect or asserting authority. It's about earning respect through how you treat people, especially in difficult moments. Officer Whitmore taught me that, and I'm grateful to him for it." Sophie Crawford asked about the distinction between queen and queen consort, and Camilla answered honestly about her own confusion and insecurity in the role. "I think I wanted to feel more important than I am," she admitted. "Not because I'm power-hungry, but because I was feeling uncertain and overwhelmed. King Charles is in Australia, and I'm here trying to manage things, and I think I overcompensated. I tried to assert an authority I don't actually have, and I was rightfully corrected." The interview lasted 30 minutes, and by the end, Camilla felt exhausted but relieved. She had said everything she wanted to say, held nothing back, and presented herself as a flawed human being trying to do her best in an impossible role. When the camera stopped rolling, Sophie Crawford looked at her with something like respect. "That was remarkably honest, Your Majesty. I think people will appreciate it." But Camilla wasn't thinking about what people would appreciate. She was thinking about whether she had done the right thing, whether honesty would be rewarded or punished, whether she had strengthened the monarchy or damaged it further. The answer came faster than anyone expected, and from a source none of the advisors had anticipated. Within an hour of the interview airing, Officer James Whitmore himself issued a statement through his commanding officer. It was brief but powerful. "I have the utmost respect for Queen Camilla and appreciate her courage in discussing our encounter so openly. She showed me great kindness in our private meeting. I believe her commitment to serving the crown and the British people is genuine and heartfelt. I'm honored to serve under her and King Charles, and I hope the media will now allow both of us to move forward and focus on our respective duties." The statement changed everything. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't about a guard embarrassing the Queen, but about two people finding mutual respect through honest communication. The tabloids that had been preparing to mock Camilla's interview found themselves without ammunition. How could they criticize someone for admitting fault when the person she'd wronged was publicly supporting her? The public reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Social media exploded with comments praising Camilla's honesty and vulnerability. Polls showed her approval ratings actually rising in the wake of the interview. People who had been critical or indifferent suddenly found themselves warming to a queen consort who seemed refreshingly human. Even the palace advisors, who had been so worried about the interview, had to admit that it had worked out far better than any carefully managed statement could have. Sir Edmund Blackwood, in a rare moment of humility, told Camilla that perhaps old strategies weren't always the best strategies. "The world has changed," he admitted. "Perhaps we need to change with it," King Charles called from Australia, his voice filled with pride and relief. "You took a risk, and it paid off. More importantly, you stayed true to yourself. That's what the monarchy needs right now: authenticity." But for Camilla, the most meaningful response came in a handwritten note delivered to her private quarters. It was from Officer Whitmore's daughter Emily, who was now recovering at home. "Dear Queen Camilla," the letter read in careful, childish handwriting. "My dad told me what happened and how you apologized to him. He said you were very brave. I think he's right. My teacher says that brave people aren't people who never make mistakes, but people who admit them and try to be better. Thank you for being brave and for caring about my dad. I hope I get to meet you someday. Love, Emily." Camilla read the letter 3 times, tears blurring her vision. She had been preparing for media judgment, public criticism, and political consequences. She hadn't been prepared for a child's simple, pure perspective on courage and character. She placed the letter in her personal safe, alongside other treasured correspondence and family photos. It would serve as a reminder, she decided, of what this whole experience had taught her: that titles and protocols and carefully managed images mattered far less than basic human decency and honest communication. The story would continue to unfold in unexpected ways, but this moment marked a turning point. Not just for Camilla's public image, but for her understanding of herself and her role. She had entered that confrontation with Officer Whitmore thinking she needed to prove her authority. She had emerged from it understanding that true authority came from a completely different place. 2 months after the interview aired, Windsor Castle hosted its annual staff appreciation ceremony. It was a tradition that dated back decades, a formal event where the royal family personally thanked employees for their service and dedication. Normally, these ceremonies were polite but somewhat stiff affairs. With prepared speeches and predictable awards for years of service, this year, Camilla decided to do things differently. She had been thinking about organizational culture, what it meant to truly value the people who kept the monarchy functioning. The palace employed hundreds of people, from guards and housekeepers to chefs and administrators, and most of them worked long hours in demanding conditions with little public recognition. The confrontation with Officer Whitmore had opened her eyes to how invisible these people often were to those they served. Working with Lady Margaret and a small committee of staff representatives, Camilla completely redesigned the appreciation ceremony. Instead of a formal receiving line in the state apartments, she moved it to the staff dining hall. Instead of predetermined awards, she asked department heads to nominate employees who had gone above and beyond. And then she personally interviewed those employees to understand their stories. The preparations took weeks and raised eyebrows among the traditionalists. Sir Edmund Blackwood questioned whether it was appropriate for the Queen Consort to spend so much time mingling with lower-level staff. The head housekeeper worried about security protocols if they moved the event to a less controlled space. Even some of the staff themselves felt uncomfortable with the changes, uncertain about this new, more informal approach. But Camilla persisted, and on a chilly December evening, the staff dining hall was transformed. White tablecloths covered the utilitarian tables. Flowers from the palace gardens created centerpieces. A string quartet played softly in the corner. And instead of standing at a distance, as the royal family usually did, Camilla planned to sit among the staff at their tables, sharing the meal with them. When King Charles returned from his tour 3 days before the ceremony, he found Windsor Castle buzzing with nervous energy. Staff members who had been preparing for weeks were both excited and terrified about the unconventional evening ahead. "You've certainly stirred things up," Charles told Camilla as they dressed for the event. "I'm hearing that people don't quite know what to expect," good Camilla said, adjusting her simple navy dress in the mirror. She had deliberately chosen not to wear a tiara or formal jewelry. Tonight wasn't about royal splendor. It was about appreciation and connection. Maybe it's time we all stopped knowing what to expect and started actually seeing each other as people. Charles smiled and kissed her cheek. "I think the past few months have changed you, for the better." The ceremony began at 7 o'clock. As staff members filed into the dining hall, they found their names on place cards at various tables. The seating had been deliberately mixed, with guards sitting next to housekeepers, chefs beside administrators, longtime employees mixed with newer ones. And at the center table, 2 empty seats waited with small cards that simply read, "Charles and Camilla." When the King and Queen Consort entered the room, there was the traditional standing and applause. But Camilla gestured for everyone to sit down quickly. "Please, no formality tonight. This evening is about all of you, not about us." She and Charles took their seats at the center table, where they were joined by 6 staff members of varying ranks and departments. One of those staff members was Officer James Whitmore. If Whitmore was surprised to find himself seated next to the Queen Consort, he hid it well. He stood politely as she approached and gave a respectful nod. His daughter Emily's medical crisis had become family dinner table conversation rather than an emergency, and he looked more rested than he had 2 months ago. Officer Whitmore. Camilla greeted him warmly. "I'm glad you could join us." "How is Emily doing?" "Very well, Your Majesty." "Thank you for asking. She's back in school and hasn't had another serious attack. The doctors have adjusted her medication, and we're all sleeping better at night." "I'm so relieved to hear that." Camilla took her seat, and the other guests at the table sat as well. "I received her letter. It's one of the most meaningful things anyone has written to me in a long time." Whitmore's face softened with paternal pride. "She was very excited when I told her you had read it. She's been practicing her curtsy, just in case she ever meets you." "Well, we'll have to arrange that," Camilla said with a smile. "Perhaps a private tour sometime when she's feeling well." The conversation at the table flowed more naturally than anyone had expected. The presence of the King and Queen Consort initially made the other staff members cautious. But Camilla's genuine questions and Charles's easy humor gradually broke down the barriers. They talked about families and hobbies, challenges and triumphs, the quirks of working in a palace, and the pride they took in their roles. During dinner, Camilla learned that the woman sitting across from her, a housekeeper named Patricia, had been working at Windsor for 40 years. Patricia spoke about watching multiple generations of royals pass through these halls, and how the job had supported her family through difficult times. "You've given your entire working life to this place," Camilla said, genuinely moved. "What's kept you here all these years?" Patricia thought for a moment before answering. "It's the history, Your Majesty. When I polish the furniture in the state apartments, I think about all the hands that have touched those same pieces over centuries. When I prepare rooms for important guests, I'm part of something bigger than myself. It's not always easy work, and sometimes we feel invisible. But we're keepers of history. That matters. The phrase "we feel invisible" struck Camilla deeply. How many times had she walked past staff members without really seeing them? How many people cleaned her rooms, prepared her meals, and maintained her schedule while remaining anonymous to her? After dinner, instead of the formal speech everyone expected, Camilla stood and did something unprecedented. She invited anyone who wanted to share a story about their work to come forward. There would be no time limits, no prescribed format. Just honest stories from real people about what their work meant to them. The first few minutes were awkward. People looked at each other uncertainly, unsure if this was really happening or if it was some sort of test. Then a young man from the kitchen staff stood up. His name was Marcus, and he had been working as an assistant chef for only 6 months. "I know I'm new here," he began nervously, "but I wanted to say something. I grew up in a council flat in East London. My mom cleaned houses, and we never had much. When I got this job, my whole family came to see the palace from the outside. They couldn't believe I actually worked here. My little brother keeps telling his friends that his brother cooks for the king." Marcus's voice strengthened as he continued. "What I want to say is that working here has given me dignity. When I put on my uniform and go into that kitchen, I'm not just the kid from the council flat anymore. I'm a chef at Windsor Castle. That changes how I see myself, and it's changed how my family sees our future. So thank you for that." The room erupted in applause. Marcus sat down, looking embarrassed but proud. And suddenly, others wanted to speak too. A security officer talked about the weight of responsibility. He felt protecting the royal family and historic treasures. A gardener spoke about the meditation he found in maintaining the ancient gardens, connecting with centuries of groundskeepers who had done the same work. An administrative assistant shared how she had gone back to school for a degree while working full-time, and how her colleagues had supported her through that challenge, one after another. People stood and shared pieces of their lives. Some stories were funny, others deeply moving. A few people cried while speaking, and several times Camilla found herself reaching for tissues as well. These weren't the faceless servants she had imagined. They were people with dreams and struggles, with families they loved and challenges they faced, all while showing up every day to serve an institution most of them believed in. After nearly an hour of stories, Officer Whitmore stood. The room quieted immediately, everyone remembering the incident that had dominated palace gossip months earlier. "I wasn't planning to speak," Whitmore began, his voice steady but emotional. "But sitting here tonight listening to everyone, I feel like I need to say something. 2 months ago, I had what you might call a difficult morning." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the room. "My daughter was in the hospital, and I made a mistake by checking my phone while on duty. When I was confronted about it, I said some things that could have cost me my job, things that, in any other workplace, probably would have ended my career." He glanced at Camilla, who met his eyes steadily. "But instead of punishment or retribution, I received something I didn't expect. I received honesty and apology from someone who didn't have to provide either. Queen Camilla could have hidden behind her position or had me quietly transferred or dismissed. Instead, she acknowledged her mistake and treated me like a human being rather than just a subordinate." Whitmore's voice grew stronger. "That took courage. Real courage, not the kind that comes from authority, but the kind that comes from character. Since then, I've watched her work to change the culture of this place, to make us feel seen and valued. This ceremony tonight is just one example. She didn't have to do any of this. She chose to." He turned to address Camilla directly. "Your Majesty, you said that I taught you something about respect. But I think you've taught all of us something more important. You've taught us that positions and titles don't define our worth, that making mistakes doesn't make us failures, and that real leadership means lifting others up, not standing above them." The standing ovation that followed was spontaneous and enthusiastic. Staff members rose to their feet, applauding not just Whitmore's words but the sentiment behind them. Camilla stood as well, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the moment. When the applause finally died down and everyone returned to their seats, Camilla remained standing. She hadn't prepared a speech, but suddenly she knew what she needed to say. Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you for sharing your stories. I have learned more in this one evening than in months of formal briefings and reports. You've shown me that this palace, this institution we're all serving, is only as strong as the people who make it function day after day. She paused, collecting her thoughts. When I married Charles, I knew I was taking on an enormous responsibility. I knew there would be protocols to learn and traditions to uphold. What I didn't fully understand was that my most important responsibility wasn't to the crown jewels or the state apartments or the ceremonial duties. It was to you, to all of you who work so hard, often invisibly, to keep this place running. Camilla looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as she could. Officer Whitmore mentioned mistakes. I want to talk about that for a moment. In my first months as queen consort, I made many mistakes. I was insecure and uncertain, and I tried to compensate by being overly authoritative. I confused position with worth, authority with respect. It took a difficult confrontation and a hard lesson to make me understand the difference. She gestured toward Whitmore. This man who has served faithfully for 15 years taught me something essential. He taught me that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through your actions, through how you treat people, especially when those people have less power than you do. The room was completely silent now, everyone hanging on her words. I don't want to be the kind of queen consort who hides behind protocol and formality. I don't want to be someone you fear or walk on eggshells around. I want to be someone you can talk to, someone who sees you as whole people with lives and families and challenges outside these walls. I want to earn your respect, not demand it. Camilla's voice broke slightly. So I'm making you all a promise tonight. I promise to listen more than I speak, to ask questions instead of making assumptions. To remember that every person in this palace, from the newest kitchen assistant to the most senior advisor, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. And when I fail at these things, because I will fail sometimes, I promise to admit it and try to do better. She raised her glass. To all of you. Thank you for your service, your dedication, and your patience with someone who's still learning how to do this job properly. The toast was met with another round of applause, but this time it felt different. Warmer, more personal. The barrier between royalty and staff hadn't disappeared completely, but it had become more permeable, more human. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, many stopped by Camilla's table to thank her personally. The interactions were brief, but meaningful, full of genuine warmth rather than performative courtesy. Officer Whitmore was one of the last to leave. He approached Camilla with something in his hand. Your Majesty, my daughter, made this for you? She wanted me to give it to you in person. He handed her a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a child's drawing. It showed two figures standing together, one in a blue dress with a crown, one in a red uniform. Between them, a little girl with pigtails held both their hands. At the top, in carefully printed letters, it read, My Dad and the Brave Queen. Camilla's composure, which had held through the entire evening, finally cracked completely. She clutched the drawing to her chest and openly wept. Please tell Emily that this is the most beautiful gift I've ever received, she managed to say through her tears, and tell her that her father is the brave one. He had the courage to speak truth to power when it mattered most. I will, Your Majesty. And thank you for everything. Not just tonight, but for everything you've done these past months to make this place feel more human. After Whitmore left, Camilla sat alone with Charles in the now empty dining hall. The string quartet had packed up, the tables were being cleared, and the space was returning to its everyday function. But something had fundamentally changed, and they both felt it. That was extraordinary, Charles said quietly, holding her hand. I've never seen anything like it in all my years. It shouldn't be extraordinary, Camilla replied, still holding Emily's drawing. This should be normal. People treating each other with basic human kindness shouldn't be revolutionary. But in this institution, with all its history and tradition and formality, it is revolutionary. You've started something important here, Camilla. You've reminded us all that the monarchy exists to serve people, not the other way around. In the days and weeks that followed, the changes Camilla had initiated continued to ripple through the palace. Staff members felt more comfortable raising concerns or suggesting improvements. The rigid hierarchy that had kept people isolated in their departments began to soften. Small acts of kindness and recognition became more common, modeled by Camilla's example. The story of the confrontation and its aftermath became part of palace lore, told to new employees as an example of how things could change for the better. Officer Whitmore became something of a legend, a guard who dared to correct the queen and help transform palace culture in the process. Emily's drawing was framed and hung in Camilla's private study, where she saw it every day. It served as a reminder of why all the protocol and tradition and ceremony mattered, not because of crowns and castles and historic grandeur, but because of real people with real lives who deserved to be seen and valued. 6 months after that night, Camilla received another letter from Emily. The girl was doing well, thriving in school, and her asthma was well controlled. But what struck Camilla most was a simple line near the end of the letter. "My dad says you changed the palace, but I think my dad changed you first. I think you both changed each other." Out of the mouths of babes, Camilla thought, smiling as she read. The girl was right. She and Officer Whitmore had changed each other. A moment of confrontation had become a catalyst for transformation. It's not just for her personally, but for the entire institution she served. She had entered that confrontation thinking she needed to prove she was the monarch. She had emerged understanding that being a monarch, or queen consort, or any kind of leader, wasn't about asserting power. It was about using whatever power and privilege you had to lift others up, to see them, to value them, and to create a culture where everyone felt their dignity was respected. It had taken a royal guard's courage and a sick child's crisis to teach her that lesson. But now, finally, she understood. Authority without compassion was tyranny. Position without humanity was emptiness. And respect without relationship was just fear wearing a different name. The confrontation that could have been a scandal or a crisis had instead become a gift. Not despite its difficulty, but because of it. Real growth rarely came from comfort and validation. It came from being challenged, from being wrong, from having to face uncomfortable truths about yourself and choosing to change rather than defend. As Camilla sat in her study that evening, looking at Emily's drawing and thinking about all that had happened, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not just contentment or satisfaction, but genuine pride. Not pride in her position or her title, but pride in having had the courage to be wrong, to apologize, to change, and to try to do better. In the end, Officer Whitmore had been right about everything. She wasn't the monarch. But maybe, through hard lessons and honest growth, she was becoming something better. She was becoming a leader worth following, not because people had to, but because they chose to. And that, she realized, was worth more than any crown.